It is the 16th of November 2023. A warm and hearty welcome to this special conversation on the Nation Leadership Forum, where we want to focus on the build-up to the KUSI Ideas 5.0, and that is a conversation on Africa Agenda 2063, the Africa that we want. Now, every year the Nation Media Group convenes the KUSI Ideas Festival, a thought leadership platform which sets the agenda for growth and development at the continental level. Ever since its inception in 2019, KUSI Ideas has emerged as a premium arena for collation of views from stakeholders across the public and private sector, as well as civil society and academia, on the most pressing challenges facing Africa and the most promising opportunities to be harnessed. KUSI Ideas has taken the discourse on the continent to Kenya and Rwanda in East Africa, as well as Ghana in West Africa. This year, KUSI Ideas takes the agenda to Southern Africa in Botswana with a focus on Agenda 2063, the continent's strategic framework which aims to deliver on Africa's goal for inclusive and sustainable development. How can Africa position itself to realize the potential? How can the continent navigate the bout of shocks which have buffeted the economy, from COVID-19 to spillovers from Russia-Ukraine war? To discuss this and more, I am joined by an eminent panel, and with me on set we have Professor Peter Kagwanja, who is the President and CEO of the Africa Policy Institute. Karibu sana. We also have Angela Mbido, Director, InfoTrack Research and Consulting. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm joined also by Paul Mudhaura, CEO, Africa Carbon Markets Initiative. Karibu sana. We shall be delving deep into matters about the macroeconomic environment, matters political economy. We shall be talking about climate change and the risks associated and how we can de-risk from that. And we want to dive straight into it. Let me start, lady and gentlemen, with a very broad question. We are in a very tough set of macroeconomic environment. We have seen defaults in Ghana. We have seen it in Zambia. There's so much debate about Kenya right now and the Eurobond coming to maturity. When you look at the prevailing state of affairs, and let me start with you, Prof, how do you think we are set for the prospects of Agenda 2063, pushing for sustainable, inclusive development and growth, given the constraints we face right now, COVID-19, Russia, Ukraine, and all the spillovers?
Well, first and foremost, I think now that we are talking about ideas, we need to ask the fundamental question whether we have really sat down to put down the ideas that are going to guide us out of the polycrisis that we have been through. And sometimes we are taking things for granted. We are coming from the worst crisis we've ever faced, even in the 19th century. In the short term, if you look at where we are coming from, we started off with the double election in 2017. That cost us a huge amount, those who know how much elections cost. Then from there, we come to the 2018 handshake. Rather than the handshake consolidating our consensus towards a certain goal and to confront what was coming through, it divided us right through the center, and the government could not perform because it was completely divided. The third thing is we were hit by locust invasion, which devastated our crops at that particular time. And before we say Jack, COVID-19 was in. Yeah. And COVID-19 was just a lockdown of the economy. If you are not on salary, if you were a private, researcher like myself and my sister, you are a lawyer, you know what that means. We close our offices, we lay down our staff and so on. And before you're out of the crisis, here is Ukraine. And our look-east policy as African continent meant that we are looking from Eastern Europe to India and China. Yeah. And that look-east policy was what was hit by that particular war, because at the heat where we were now opening new frontiers of giving new windows to our economy. Yes. Ukraine, Russia, and Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. And before we have even had a breath, here we are with Hamas, Israel kind of war now, which is escalating. But I don't know how it is going to be in the next 5 days, because if Turkey and other countries go in support of Gaza, if not Hamas, then we are deep into this crisis. Now, within that framework, we've been talking about climate change, and we've been talking about the climate change summit in Nairobi. Yes, which I think we mishandled, because yes, it is good to go climate, It's good to have climate change, it's good to have health, all these things. For Kenya, it sounds very good, and it's a good sound bite. But the truth of the matter is that no country have ever industrialized on clean energy. So we'll be the first to industrialize on clean energy. How do we expect to industrialize to create the jobs that we badly need to deal with our youth bulge?
So you're raising the issue of the just transition.
There is a just transition, and we need a fair, a good understanding of what is climate change is about.
Okay.
Not to cut trees, of course, but not to be told that you cannot utilize the coal in Mui Valley.
Professor, allow me to hold you at that and bring in Angela Ambilo to give us her introductory thoughts.
I agree with Prof, but as I was driving here, I was thinking about the fundamental question of our African hegemonies and why we don't have strong hegemonies. Because problems will be there, whether they're existential or otherwise. The question is how you deal with those problems. And my thinking is that unless and until we are able to crack this issue, and I'm glad that we have the Africa Agenda 2063, which wants an Africa for Africans. Yeah. Because I question really whether we've had an Africa for Africans, including when we speak about climate change and all these things. Yeah. Let me just, throw out some numbers. We have a burgeoning youth population, 420 million now, but will be 770 million in 2050. Is that a curse or is it a blessing? A strong hegemony would look at it as a blessing. Yeah. Because in itself, it is your workforce, it is your market, and it is really where you can harness all these great ideas on entrepreneurship that the world so badly needs. Yeah. And Africa has this. But unless and until we have a continent that understands and perhaps starts looking at itself from a very Afrocentric point of view and saying what then makes us Africa for Africans, we will not move. Africa Agenda 2063 will end up like its predecessors. Like we've had with OAU. And really many people are talking about AU also being just equally somewhat moribund in its nature, lackluster in its nature. Now another, statistic, and allow me to just throw the numbers. So 60% of our population is young. To me, that is a blessing. Since 2020, we have had 9 coups.
Yes.
In Africa.
The so-called coup belt.
Yes.
Yeah.
That tells us something. There is discontent, and without political stability, what we are calling Agenda Africa 2063 will never be realized because we need stability. Yeah. Now, if we look at most of these countries, many of them have emanated from direct rule, so assimilation. What does that say to us in terms of whether they are strong, hegemonies, whether they're strong, democracies or countries on their own, or there is external influence? Yeah. And how then will we deal with this external influence? We pussyfoot around it, but I think until and unless we're able to speak honestly about it, all these things will be a mirage. Yeah. This would be my opening statement, that we need to really be looking and addressing these issues frontal, so that we can move, progressively by coming up with solutions that we can come up with on our own. Okay. What will be the next frontier, and what are the areas that I perceive or have been discussions that I've had with some peers, both in academia and elsewhere, on areas that we must look at? We cannot ignore renewable energy. We cannot ignore genetics. We cannot ignore digitality and AI. We cannot ignore infrastructure. Those are areas that Africa will need to deal with. And this is where we burden ourselves, because more often than not, rather than get the resources from within, we're looking for Bretton Woods.
Let me hold you there, Angela. Quite some spot-on points you've raised there, which I'll be coming back to, especially the renewable energy, genetics, digitality, and AI. Paul, the matters of climate change, just transition, are very close to what you do on a day-to-day basis. Please give us your introductory thoughts.
I think I'd build on what the great points Angela made, that even as we talk about looking at solutions and scaling those solutions, it's critical that we do it in some level of coordinated continental approach. That when you start looking at even the opportunities around renewable energy, I think, Prof, completely hear you that countries have not industrialized under renewable energy, but the sheer cost reduction we're seeing year on year in the viability of renewable energy means, if anything, Africa has an opportunity to do what no one else could. Even when you look at the opportunity ahead of us, you know, when you look at really the transition in energy, unlike, unfortunately, as an undeveloped area, Africa doesn't have historical infrastructure that needs to be exited and replaced by new. So we can actually build new, sustainable, right, and scale it much, much faster than anywhere else. I think it's a key point that even His Excellency the President often makes, that why can't Africa become a destination for high energy need production, relying purely on renewable energy. Our capacity for renewable energy is almost incomparable globally. When you look even at the simple things like the opportunity you can get from carbon capture and storage. Elsewhere they say that's so expensive because of the amount of energy you need to produce. But here, Kenya's case, we have an excess amount of energy we produce, but then the reason our electricity is so expensive is we take off so little. You're taking off 3 gigs when you're producing 300. There's a disconnect. Unless we can really escalate the amount of energy offtake, scale industries happening, and able to do it purely on renewable energy, that can be transformational. That's what creates jobs. And when we talk about our huge young population, it means that you have a pool of resources that don't need to be retrained. They can be built, trained on the right areas, and run. And we have age on our side. They can run long-term and very impactfully.
Yeah. We
don't have a transition cost. And that's the thing we often don't take into account when we look at our opportunity.
But Paul raises a very important issue, which is actually part of Agenda 2063, and that is the ability, when you talk about the climate change conversation, scalability is a big question. And part of scalability is being able to finance a just transition. And Prof, let me bring you in here, because when we went to COP27, there was so much discussion around the loss and damage facility, which will be able to cater to the aspect that there are countries like Kenya, from the developed side, which haven't contributed as much to the damage we're now seeing, and they need to be catered to in a particular way. When you look at where we are right now, it looks like the loss and damage has just fallen off. No one talking much about it. Do you see us addressing this issue of financing climate change sustainably for Africa?
The first question we want to ask, and I want to be controversial here, is whether the promises that have been made to us globally in the past have been met. And it's on the basis of that where you can trust new promises being made.
Yeah.
Remember, these are these are things that are coming like whims. You know, I want to support those who are for green energy, but there is no a major contractual obligation that you must do this or you must do that. And those of us who are historians and political scientists are familiar with our discourses from the group of 77 and the promises that countries made that we are going to cut to give 0.7% of our GDP to uplift Africa. Before we said Jack, we were into the worst situation that we can be in the 1980s, what we call now the lost decades.
Yeah.
So we lost literally 3 decades, 1980, 1990, and part of the 2000. We lost it. Until we came to our senses and said, this is what we want to do for ourselves. And Agenda 2063 is a product of that thinking. We gave ourselves this hope and said, we are now going to embark on African Renaissance, and Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki led us in that. They established Renaissance institutes in South Africa and elsewhere, and we have Renaissance professors and so on, to make sure that we buy this idea that it is about African solutions to African problems. Yeah. These were not just jargon that they were throwing around. It was as a result of that experience. Now, we cannot rely on the collective global consensus to fund our specific problems. And therefore, Africa need to wake up and smell the coffee. And it's good for us to be in parties in Jomo Kenyatta, in KICC, in Paris, and Mexico, and elsewhere. But when we come home, it is important to be clear that it is upon us to make our choices about where to move. When you look at Agenda 2063 and its energy projection, the worry that the world has is that if Agenda 2063 is pursued the way it is pursued, by 2050, the world will be in a dire crisis as far as climate change is concerned. The carbon emission from Africa will be highest. Why? Because Africa is the new frontier of petroleum, gas, coal, and so on. Yeah. And in addition to the Middle East and other parts of the world which have this, then what you'll have at the end of the day will be that every part of the world will be emitting carbon. Currently, Africa is emitting less than 3% of the carbon, globally. So by the time we reach 2063 or 2050, we'll be emitting almost the same level as Europe, because we will be industrializing. Because Agenda 2063 on the new, the African we want is about industrialization in order to deal with the youth badge. So talking about fair, discussion on climate change, it is either the West or the rest of the world, including China, is willing to support Africa's industrialization through an alternative path, so that we cool our heels on using our fossil energy resources. Yeah. Or alternatively, they allow us to move like everybody else, and we move the equal tandem. Why? Because the West is not cutting down on its use of whatever. In fact, they are intensifying. With the war in Ukraine, what have you seen? Countries like Germany turning to coal. Yeah. We've seen other countries in their different way turning to wood and so on. So the point is that we need to have a more candid discussion. This is not to say that countries like Kenya, which are naturally endowed by our Creator with renewable energies, we have to utilize our energy in geothermal energy. Yeah. We have to utilize our sun because it's here with us. Garissa, Mandera, and other parts of our country are our gold mines as far as these things are concerned. The wind, it is here, and so on. We will utilize it. But at the same time, we need to have a candid discussion as to whether Africa should also be around to do what the rest of the world is doing in order to catch up in terms of industrialization. I have said again and again, if we don't industrialize, we perish. Yeah. Why do we perish? Because the youth badge is here with us. Our children need jobs. Yeah. Today, I am private to information from research that on average we have almost two kids who have degrees in major families in Mount Kenya region, particularly Murang'a, where I come from, who have finished degrees, employable degrees, medicine, engineering, but have no jobs in the family. So those are resources that are locked there. So what is the point here? That we need to have a fair debate on the climate change, not the vogue. What we had in Nairobi was that vogue. Why do I say so? South Africa could not attend. Why? Because almost 80% of its energy comes from coal. Because you'll be attacking them. Nigeria was not here because it is totally dependent on petroleum for its own survival, not only in its energy, but also its income. Countries like Egypt, Sudan, and others could not participate. Only those countries that are have a modicum of reliance on renewable resources had the courage to come here. So the climate change in Nairobi was a success for Kenya because we showcased who we are in terms of the giant of the renewable energy. But then we divided Africa through the middle.
Let me bring in Angela at that point on the candid conversation we need to have, especially within the context of the youth bulge.
I think there are various things that, portend, especially with the youth bulge. The first one is what opportunities, governments will be thinking about, planning for the various sectors that we have. And I'd mentioned the areas that I think government should really think about. The first one, which Kenya is very good at and is renowned for, is IT and digitality. What worries me is that today a country like Kenya is seemingly punitive when it comes to that which should be an opportunity for youth. If you talk to young people today, and I remember in 2003, when the Kibaki regime came in, the first thing that they did then is that they almost zero-rated, tax on computers, on phones, and all implements that were going to, and that is how we became the hub. We became the Silicon Valley of Africa. But today, we have reintroduced these elements that obviously will make it very difficult for our young kids who have a lot of potential, especially in the area of digitality. Yeah. What did COVID teach these young people? These young people were taught some good and bad things, but they were taught first and foremost that, they could work from anywhere. And so today you find that a lot of them are supporting organizations in the US, in the global north, and earning good incomes, which we should actually, promote. On the flip side, I have read and found it very interesting that we are actually the brains behind most people getting degrees in the global north.
Yes.
Now that is a good thing, because it then says equally, although it is in itself academic,
it's called contractual cheating.
cheating. But having said that, what would it tell a good polity? What would it tell a government? That you actually have people who are so sharp that do not sit in any classroom anywhere and are able to do papers up to doctoral level for people sitting in the global north.
Yeah.
It's something that we should be tapping. And if you don't tap it, then we will be seeing very many situations where we will have what in Nigeria they call the yao girls and boys. People who are very well educated, like the situation that Prof has just talked about, with no wherewithal. Yeah. They have nothing to do, and therefore you are very intelligent, and you will start thinking of how to make money quick. Yeah. Indeed, there are parts of Kenya, somebody was laughing with me the other day, we were having a conversation and we were saying that there are parts of Nyanza right now where the young men are so intelligent that they have indeed become the yao boys and girls of Kenya.
That part of town.
Of Kenya. There are so many other things that I think we should be doing with our young people. We need to be inspiring hope in them. I will again throw some numbers to you.
Just one before we take a break.
Yeah.
Just one.
One number.
Yes.
Okay. That, over 50% of most people in Africa are finding it difficult this year to survive. So in South Africa, according to Ipsos, 39% say it has become very difficult to survive. In Morocco, it's 40%. In Nigeria, it's 66%. In Zambia, it's 59%. But guess what it is in Kenya? 82%.
Yeah.
Now, you remember yourself, and you still look young, but I remember myself when I was young. And if you would not, have that sense of hope to get things done, that there's a future for you, and we belong to that 82%, you can imagine what will be happening to our young population.
Let me hold Angela Ambido on that very important point of the sense of despondency that is prevailing across the continent and by the numbers mostly in Kenya. We are taking a quick break. We shall come back and piggybacking on that point, speaking to the issue of the prevailing macro environment and how we take it forward from here. So stay tuned. And if you're just joining us, welcome back to this conversation where we are talking about Africa Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. Before the break, we were discussing matters around climate change and the risks that it has precipitated and how we can have a just transition, especially for the African context. We have also touched on issues regarding the youth bulge and the opportunity and risk that it presents, especially the prevailing situation that we are in. And we want to pivot now into a conversation that I'm seeing online being raised by many of you who are watching us. And the question is, when we talk about Agenda 2063 within the prevailing macro environment, which has a lot of debt distress, some countries have gone into default, where really is the hope? And that's the question to Paul Mulaura. Where do you see the hope, Paul?
I think it's us taking a step back and really assessing where do we stand, where can we be competitive, and what can we do that other people cannot? What's the space we fill? And that's the huge opportunity I re-emphasize we get from really effectively leveraging renewable energy. I take you, Prof, that it's not available everywhere, but what are we doing around energy transmission? There's centers in this continent where more than what we need can be generated. Why is it not being kind of moved effectively to where it's most needed? Why do we keep, as each nation, trying to build our own energy buffer when you can, if we, the Continental Free Trade Area, the AU conversation, it can be so transformative if we get it working. If we're not fighting as countries, and if we're not overly competing on the details, not the outcomes. When you even look at things like some of the transactions being locked in on carbon credits, if you can come to this country and they tell you, well, we will not sell it below this number. You go next door and they're like, oh, we need money. We'll sell at any number. We undermine ourselves. We undermine our credibility. And how do we shift that conversation? How do we start thinking with a common voice, with a common intention on outlook? Prof, I hear you on your point that, well, Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, but those are the very jurisdictions that are now taking huge strides in unlocking the opportunities that can come from carbon markets. Nigeria is taking big steps on diesel decommissioning viability, building methodologies around that. Egypt is trying to set up one of the premier carbon credit trading facilities on this continent, and they're seeking to trade for everyone else. South Africa is the first jurisdiction on this continent to introduce a carbon tax. And now they're trying to understand, okay, we have a tax, but how do we then now build in our Article 6, country to country and corporate to country transactions and our voluntary carbon markets? And they're reaching out to say, how do we do this? How do we unlock this value? Because there's undoubted value, but we need to own it. We need to capitalize it. We need to take the right steps. But until we make those coordinated decisions, we'll keep saying, why isn't it better? Why are we not moving? Why are we not taking the steps that we hoped could be unlocked? And I come back to that point that we have such a young, growing population. But if we're not steering them in directions where they can create jobs, they are actually being employed by scale industries that the world, the roadmap to 2050 is getting shorter every day. Our emissions levels are completely unsustainable. More and more, companies will make a decision that we can't stay within our net zero commitments unless we move to a place where we can generate our output at a lower emissions cost. What are we doing as Africa to say, come, we are ready? And we're creating the necessary legal and policy environment to create transparency. We made the point that we're having so much political unrest. But you can't have political unrest and then wonder why money is not flowing in your direction. Unless you build stability, transparency, and a bit of transparency. money cannot come. So what are we doing to create a conducive environment to attract capital to come in? It's all looking for a destination, but it needs a destination where they're not afraid policy will change overnight, and then the value of that money will just disappear. So what are we doing to create an environment that attracts transformation, that attracts impact? Those are the decisions we need to make.
Paul, how do you, very quickly, how do you respond to those who say that, look, even as you talk about these issues about the carbon markets and the necessity of greening our energy infrastructure, the capital expenditure involved in some of these undertakings, one is heavy upfront, two is deemed to be high risk. And even though we are seeing capital sitting on one hand, they will tell you that, look, we're not sure we have the risk appetite, and we don't even see what we would call the viable investment cases across the continent to take up this kind of investment.
But part of that problem, it goes to that scaling issue. As long as you're delivering small solutions, it's very hard for money to move to small solutions. What steps are we taking to allow things to scale to a level that actually now money can consciously think about moving there? What steps are we taking around de-risking so that even if money needs to come to an early stage, but if it comes, that entity moves to a whole other level of production and becomes much more commercially viable? What are we doing to create that de-risking tools? You know, as ACMI, we're engaging with parties like MIGA under the World Bank, really looking at a number of financial sector institutions, really trying to build appropriate financial mechanisms that can allow capital to flow to where it is. Yeah. But unless we have clear, transparent, and stable legal frameworks, money just won't come because they don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Prof, let me take you back to that question we asked about, and I'm seeing lots of those questions online about the prevailing macro environment. And many guys are asking that, you know, what has complicated the prevailing situation, especially around debt, is that unlike when we had the famous HIPIC initiative, currently the pool of creditors is extremely diverse. We have China, we have Saudi Arabia, and the discussion around this restructuring becomes very difficult relative to what it has been in the past. How does Africa look into 2063, cognizant of lessons we are now drawing from the prevailing debt situation?
Let's look at debt at two levels. Debt can be a lesson that you can move from debt to investment, rather than meaning if your relationship with a specific country, let's say China and Kenya, has been government to government loans. Now you move from there and encourage the flow of investments, and we've seen that happening. Now the standard gauge railway was built on the basis of government to government loans. Yeah. We saw Uhuru Kenyatta signing with Xi Jinping, and we saw the railway coming. That's a debt, and you have to pay that. But we never saw anywhere Uhuru Kenyatta sitting to sign the debt for the expressway, which was built very fast. Why? Because the expressway is an investment only that is guaranteed by the government, and within a period of 20 years, it reverts back to the country, whether the people have recouped their interest or not. It's an investment, so it has no loan attached to it. So I think for Africa, the movement should be away from loans to investments, and that's more sustainable. Because there's a limit to how much a government can borrow, legitimately. And then
I like the legitimately.
Yeah. Then the other thing is all about the environment in which we are borrowing. We are borrowing in an environment. This is the second point about the debt. In an environment which is characterized by what we're calling the second, Cold War. And the second Cold War is more propaganda. And we're also living in an age, I don't know whether you know this, my brother, called the post-truth politics.
Yes. The
post-truth politics where the lie is more important than the truth. If the lie continues to go on, then you tell a lie. And as a result, this is where we are going about, what do you call these articles that are fictitious, the fake news, yes, and fake this, fake that. And they become part of the news. Now, the debt, for example, that we have, 83% of our debts on the African continent is to the West, IMF, World Bank, and the others. China and India and others comprise less than 4% of the debt from the African continent. We've not even started consuming the resources that, you know, China is producing. America and Europe are actually consuming most of the Chinese debts. But because we are in this situation where debt is the easiest way of gaining influence in a certain country, because he who pays the piper calls the tune. Therefore, you have to discourage. So as we are discouraging debt from China and India and other countries, we are raising debt with IMF. Today you read in the papers, we are busy planting trees over the weekend so that we get $550 million from the IMF or whatever it is. Now, so we are not done away with the debt. We are still with the debt, but it is whose debt we take. Then these debts start kicking in, particularly from the West, and then you have to pay them. Now, so we need to have a bit of enlightening ourselves and our population about the politics around debt. Take, for example, some of the projects that have been funded through our RUC-East policy. By RUC-East policy, we mean we're looking to the European, part of Europe that is not part of the European Union, Ukraine, Russia, and so on. We are looking to India and the countries when we are looking to China and the Far East. That's what RUC-East means. It's not China, Africa, the way it has been seen. It's looking east. Our debt to the east, because they are targeted and they are decided by us, are making profit. I can now announce here, and you can check this record, that the SGR is the most profitable project we have had in this country, making more than 45 million profit per year. That's on record. Ask the railway people, why are we saying so? Now go and book your ticket today, right? Go and book your ticket today. You can't get to December. Why? Because people are moving.
But turnover is not profit.
But railway, no.
Turnover is not profit.
No, I'm not talking about turnover.
Yes.
I'm talking about six going and back per day. Six trips, carrying 7,000 people per day. So what we are saying, in short, we are saying projects that are profitable, you can invest in because they're sustainable. And by the way, railways, our Kenya Airways, and I want to announce this, I might look stupid to some economists, railways, our KQ, the flag carrier, and others are not supposed to make profit. If you want them to make profit, get your profit from bridges. Because they're supposed to bridge our economy. They are connectors of our economy, by and large. Because if you don't have them, the economy is not connected.
Let me hold you there, Prof. Yeah, we could have a very long debate about SGR, because the numbers I have show a very different story. But let me bring in Angela Mbido here. And someone is asking online, what is the social cost of this debt conversation? Even as we talk about Agenda 2063, we're now seeing a lot of debate around taxation. How do citizens get involved in a very proactive manner to ensure that they are part of this and are not just dealing with the consequences?
I think the first thing that we saw, at least with Kenya, and I know it's happened in parts of West Africa, is that most citizens were very vocal and vibrant in their discussions with regards to, the culmination, towards the culmination of the finance bill, and were emphatic about, what they felt about taxes. Suffices to add, they feel today, I think many Kenyans feel that their voices were not heard. What is the repercussion of this? I have, as I watched the whole discussion take place, the one thing that became clear to me is that if you force a small business person to pay that which they feel they shouldn't pay, they will find loopholes to evade tax. And I think this is why we're seeing a situation now where our taxman reported last month that he was,
behind
unable,
targets,
and by quite a large margin.
Yeah.
That is going to continue. And therefore you find yourself in a situation where human beings generally, I believe, are good. But if you push a human being to the corner then you make us do things that in many cases we do not want to do. And today, if you talk to business, we do research. If you talk to business people, they tell you, I do not see where my tax is going to go.
Yeah.
And because I cannot see where this tax is going, and this is not just confined to Kenya, then I will perhaps find ways of paying a tax consultant to help me ensure that I am not going to, plainly putting it, evade the tax that I do not feel I ought to pay. And it's linked to the many things, therefore, that we have discussed, including the repayments of debt. I don't think Kenyans have an issue, and Africans at large have an issue with debt. Suffices that and provided that it actually is, used in a proper, transparent and accountable manner.
Yeah.
I think the problem that behooves Africa today is that part of the appetite that we have for debt is to line people's pockets. These accusations that have been made, because there have been many cases, indeed, including when we were discussing the finance bill, which is now a law. We couldn't quite understand from government where the pockets of monies were going to. I don't know whether I'm the only one who still, up till today, is unclear on every single detail in terms of where every single shilling of the debt or the borrowing goes to, line by line and line item. And we are told that this is not information that is in the public purview, as it ought to be. And so the social cost, therefore, is that you have a population that is increasingly hating tax, whilst tax is something that we know is necessary to finance the very many things that we need to have as a governable people. And in the same breath, thinking to themselves, what is it that you can do to evade the tax? And also to avoid tax. But I think there's also a very negative attitude towards the institutions that perhaps we should see as friends. Bretton Woods, who come in handy right now, they're with us. There are governments that have been able to develop. I think, as Prof mentioned, during the Kibaki regime, we were almost able to ease ourselves of, the debt burden that we had, at least from these Bretton Woods institutions, because they come with a noose, whether we like it or not. And many of us are indeed consultants for these institutions. And yes, they are very good for developing and developed nations alike. But we need to be alive to, the flip side in terms of the negative impact of some of these institutions. And today you hear people saying and chiding, we're planting trees for the Mzungu. We should never plant trees for anybody but ourselves.
That's true. And that mention of the trees came actually with the Prof alluding to the Resilience and Sustainability Facility from the IMF. We have a minute to take a break. Let me bring in Paul very fast. Paul, many have asked, and I'd even briefed you about this, about the role of what we are now seeing as debt for nature swaps. When you talk about Africa's agenda going forward, we have seen Gabon going down this road. Very briefly, Paul.
No, I think around the world you're seeing a number of solutions evolving, where people are now taking, you take debt that is serviced through even credit generation opportunities. You have a window to put in place the right infrastructure that allows now for credit generation, that you now service that debt through credits, not shillings or dollars. That's the opportunity we need to unlock. When you look at debt for nature swaps, it is how we building an understanding of the value proposition and the return on that value, where you're taking large spaces of land, putting in nature solutions, then how is that being appropriately priced so it's able to service the debt that was taken on? But I think to the same extent, as we look at those debt for nature swaps, we need to really take a step back and really start unpacking when we're looking at kind of energy transition solutions, credit solutions, how are we selecting those that will give us the strongest price return. And then how we're creating the frameworks that produce a conducive environment for that to be a reality. I think very easily Africa is often seen as 70% of our credit projection is allocated to nature-based. But when you look at the opportunities in even the direct air capture, carbon collection and storage, the opportunities in certain jurisdictions like Kenya, where we have the basalt rock in the Rift Valley, which can allow you to actually inject and store CO2 for eons, very long-term storage. You can unlock huge amounts of value. But what are we doing to incentivize that kind of behavior?
Yeah.
And as we look at really our competitiveness, how conscious are we that if we become a destination for high energy, low emission production, we're actually outcompeting the sources of our donor funds. So they will not be the first ones to jump over to help you get there. So what are we doing as a continent to work together to facilitate that? Even making clear decisions that why don't we let X country be the central producer of X and Y, this country be the generator of X and Y, so we stop competing and really put aside the kind of the very narrow national priorities versus regional opportunities. Even the scope of what could have flown from EAC has never quite achieved its full potential.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we've just had discussions with ECOWAS, who are now trying to look at how they can build a carbon market across 15 countries. Definitely there are challenges in that, building cohesion and consistency in laws across that many jurisdictions, but it's a decision that needs to be backed up and supported for it to turn into reality. But it's us structuring those decisions and building a bit of cohesion in what we're trying to work towards and work towards a common purpose. That's what we need to do.
Paul, there's a Kenyan who is asking online, before we take a very quick break, about, Paul is talking about having carbon markets across jurisdictions, yet we have power pools which have never worked. Like the East African power pool, for instance. Yeah.
As a decision have to be made. I can't disagree. We need to make decisions and stand behind the decisions we've made so that you actually have true level revenue being unlocked and equitably allocated. Until that happens, if we keep thinking if we create a facilitative environment, we're helping Uganda or Tanzania, let's slow down. It's short-sighted. If we're building easy flows of that power across the region, we're able to grow scale industry in this region, which can employ everyone, create revenue in this region. But we need to think broader and more constructed.
Right, that point by Paul Mudhaura takes us to another quick break. When we come back, I can see lots of questions about what Agenda 2063 means for education and human capital across the region. We shall be delving into that with my panelists right after the break. Welcome back to this conversation. We are discussing Africa Agenda 2063. We actually wish we had like 2 hours just to unpack all this, but nonetheless, we want to get to the tail end of this and really wrap up pretty fast. So many questions online about, are we adequately preparing our population from a human capital standpoint, given the demands of the future? We've seen the digitalization. Everyone is asking whether AI will take over all our jobs. Let me start with Angela, then come to Prof.
I think, as I had mentioned earlier, there are 5 or 6 areas that any self-serving, I'd put them down actually coming here, self-serving government needs to think about for its burgeoning youth population. The first one is obviously technology and innovation. And so our government should be thinking, and African governments should be thinking very clearly of how to mainstream in the curricula areas to do with digitization, technology, and indeed, artificial intelligence cannot be ignored. Will it replace some of our jobs? If we don't prepare ourselves adequately enough to then, you know, deal with AI efficiently, of course it will.
Don't you want it to take some jobs? You apply yourself
so
to
you apply,
yes.
exactly.
Yeah.
So you need to then be thinking of that which you will be doing with AI. And I would be hoping that in our curricula right now, we are so futuristic thinking as the Silicon Valley of Africa, and saying, what are the kids who are starting school, junior, secondary, and talking about or learning with regards to AI? And what courses are we, you know, mainstreaming in our universities? Now, if you talk to many people who are in university today, they will tell you that in that area we're still, you know, not quite there. But then we also have the population that is already within the space, and it is, I think, the onus is on government to ensure that our populations are better equipped with whatever programs they can you know, get the youth to join and participate in, but also provide them with the wherewithal, the tools to deal with the digital. Because it will be that which provides us with that, you know, competitive advantage, and that competitive advantage will not be, you know, secluded or confined to specific areas. It will be in renewable energy and climate change. It will be in sustainable agriculture. It will be in the areas of health. It will be in the areas of media and communication. And that is what our governments in Africa should be thinking about. Because I think this is one of those areas that Africa will play in quite nicely. We have a creative mindset. You know, they say that Global North is normally very focused. Global South is very creative. We're able to multitask and deal with very many things at the same time. And indeed, dealing with things like that which now is confounding many people, like digitality and AI, is something that I think our youthful population will deal with. We have to then also be looking at, you know, Paul's area in terms of, you know, renewable and sustainable energy. It is not an area that we can run away from. And indeed, we need to then be equipping our populations with the same skills, the same wherewithal, to actually deal with the immense potential that is available to our populations. We have been listening and hearing about, you know, our skilled health workers, you know, the flight of our, you know, to the global north. Is that necessary, really? I don't think so. If we can actually tool them and skill them well enough that they can deal with areas that are emerging in terms of healthcare. Biotechnology. I, the other day, was confounded when I visited a hospital it's called Tenwek. Which actually brings in all these specialists from across the globe, but specifically from Africa. They're doing incredible things with regards to, you know, very specialized heart surgeries, brain surgeries, but you will need, you know, the support, the medical support in terms of those people will be the nurses that you deal with, the lab technicians that you deal with, the people who are, you know, looking after all the equipment that is necessary. Africa has that potential so that we can then attract medical tourism. Why is medical tourism in India? When we have Mombasa, we have Nyanyuki, we have Kisumu, which could be very, you know, prime places for medical tourism. Education and skills development cannot be ignored. Why? Because we have a population that has to survive.
Can I just hold you there, Angela, and come to Professor here on the same point? Education, human capital, are we preparing ourselves adequately?
I think we are trying to, but we're quite completely disjointed, and we're still caught up in our campaign euphoria that we've not really gotten to the level of policy making and policy implementation that in a very strategic and pointed way get us to where we want to get. But let me make these points regarding that. First, we have seen our middle class declining, and we are not doing anything about it. And the middle class is the consumer. The high point of the Kibaki administration was this, meteoric rise of the middle class, which saw supermarkets even permeating the most remote of our villages. Why? Because they are consumers, the middle class. And we see movement from urban areas to rural areas because the middle class is the connector of various sectors of government. That's going on. Second, obviously, there's nothing we can do to stop the youth badge because we are having farm raise and we're producing. Therefore, the youth badge will be with us. Yeah. And absolutely, we are doing nothing about it. The crunch time is coming. Third, we assume that at a certain level, and that was the problem with the previous Jubilee government, that debts can develop. Debts don't develop. It is what you have chosen to develop which matters, whether it's going to pay the debts. Debts don't develop. Yeah. Second, we are now assuming in the new administration that tax develop. Tax don't develop. In fact, they are even the worst strategy. So debt is not a development strategy. Taxes are not a development strategy. Therefore, what does it require us to do? What you have asked. We deal with our capacity development and skilling of our people. Yes, we do. We have what we are calling TVETs, technological. They are all over the country. Yeah. I did a study with one of the donors, and I am a chair of a board of governors of one of technical institutions. We have technology in those institutions installed which can make spare parts. And nobody has even thought about making spare parts to cut on cost of importing spare parts, or making things like nails so that we stop importing some of these things from outside. So skilling and capacity development for our people is key. We have the institutions, but at a certain stage, we prioritize the theoretical work that we even turn certain institutions into technologies, to universities, when we did not need to do that. So it was a mistake, but we can walk back. The other thing which has been talked about is industrialization. The fear that the West has about us is that we industrialize in a manner that we pollute the environment. But I believe there is a way in which we can industrialize without polluting the environment. Yeah. And I think those are the strategies we need to look into. How can we industrialize as a continent and as a people without polluting our environment? And if we do, we plant enough trees to absorb our carbon, that is emerging from there. The point that is being raised here is about technology. The cutting edge technology, the emerging technology, the artificial intelligence, and other forms of technologies in medicine, in bioeconomy, and so on. Now, in this area, the big question is whether Africa will have access, because we are not in the front line of these technologies in terms of engineering, the way we are in front in IT relating to money transition like M-Pesas and so on. But how do we do that? We need to focus on our comparative advantage as a continent. One is abundance of land to feed the world. We are the only part of the world remaining which has arable land that can feed the world. What are we doing about food security, not just for ourselves, but for the world market? We're doing absolutely nothing. Now, two, even what we are producing for agriculture, we are selling it raw. People are now competing to sell avocados to China, to India, and elsewhere, and we're selling raw avocados. How many products can you get from an avocado? From oil, for cooking, oil for, your bathing, oil for everything, to medicine coming from, I'm told, the seed, and so on and so forth. We are not exploring a multiplicity of things that can come from products that we grow in our own farms, not just food. So in conclusion, I would also say, we have not done what other civilizations have done. We have not capitalized on our culture and art as a source of permanent income. How many movies have you seen on anything Kenyan? Except The Lion King, perhaps.
You'll be told about the cost of production.
Yes. So the whole issue is that we need our governments across Africa to begin moving from knowledge to production, not from politics and populism to wherever, because this is what we're doing. You wake up in the morning and think that the sun should be moving from west to east, and you announce that the sun is going now to move from west to east. Something that cannot happen.
Let me hold you there, Prof, and bring in Paul. And Paul, there's a question here for you, and I think this question is quite spot on. We cannot have a conversation about Africa Agenda 2063 without Paul commenting on the role of capital markets in Agenda 2063. You get where that is coming from.
I have a dark history. So before I go into capital markets, I think I just want to touch on this point on digitization, because I think it's even us how we leverage that opportunity. Because when you look at some of the realities and time delays we're facing on even things like monitoring, reporting, and validation exercises to qualify something as a tradable credit, you can have a 2 to 7 year delay because you're waiting for someone to come to the global north to come and try and understand our realities, then do verification. But the steps towards digitizing that process are significantly shortening the time delays in getting that turned around, but also making sure the cost is lowered and you're able to bring in kind of context-specific expertise to make that a much faster reality. And how are we leveraging that opportunity? You have emerging platforms, because the data, access to data is what can be the biggest kind of value driver because of transparency. So how are we leveraging these moments to make sure data access is getting higher, clearer? Everything now can have a chip. You can use IoT to track anything. With that level of transparency, how are we turning that opportunity into revenue-generating opportunities? It's making sure the right steps, the right environment is being created to promote that. That if we keep having, you talk about, a project developer who has one project for his tiny community, that's never of the appropriate scale. What we're trying to do as ACMI is really figure out the mechanics to truly scale generation opportunities on this continent, so that then it can become a lot more attractive for real capital flow allocation and return. But to the capital markets question, I think capital markets are about, it's back to the same issues. It's clarity, confidence, and effectiveness that makes it work. So in terms of how do you really package investment opportunities for someone to say, okay, I get it, now I'd like to put money into it. That's what the capital markets are doing, giving them a channel to pass that money through, but it relies on sufficient transparency of information. It relies on appropriate infrastructure to move that money. It relies on confidence that it will not change overnight. You know what the legal framework is. You know with certainty that what you've bought is actually what is written on the box. And really that's what we're trying to drive on the carbon markets agenda of the continent, that you can start understanding that an African credit is absolutely equivalent to a European credit. So you don't price them differently. Now it becomes a question of, can the African credit access the European CBAM market? How do we allow these ones to also start being able to benefit from that price opportunity? It's the information and clarity and data quality able to build around that, and the certainty of the rule framework under which they're generated. Then people can say, okay, if that's the fact, please come into our space.
We have 3 minutes to close, so let me just take a minute each with your parting shot on the subject of Agenda 2063. There's a gentleman here who's saying, Julians, your conversation should have been purely about climate finance. By the way, I think I agree with you. We shall have a next conversation on that. Angela, your closing thoughts. 1 minute, please.
I should start by saying I wouldn't have anything to say about climate finance. But I think Agenda 2063, as I started off saying, I think is a noble idea. It is Africa for Africans. And indeed, if there is goodwill from the leadership, various stakeholders, I think we can actually start dreaming and imagining an Africa that can, feed the whole globe, because we have sustainable agriculture. We can have a youth population that is enviable. because they are, you know, harnessing digitality, and they are, you know, dealing with the creative economy. But more importantly, I think we need to start holding our leadership to account. Promises must be met, irrespective of, you know, where in Africa we are. We need to have the systems of accountability that ensure that elected leaders are held to account.
Prof, 1 minute.
I think the best thing that has happened to us in the new millennium, in the 21st century, is the shift from the politics of liberation to now the politics of economy and development. And that's what Agenda 2063 is about, that Africa's focus should now be on the economy. And therefore, we are now on the level of what you're calling economic liberation. Now, economic liberation has to focus on our youth badge. And the youth badge give us two dividends to it if we tap it well. One, the largest market in human history is going to be in Africa. Second, that we are going to have human capital, but we must invest in technology for our African youths. And finally, we must look at our value addition to the global economy. Yeah. One of the value addition is essentially agriculture. But we have to turn our agriculture into an industry if we are going to make ends meet, which means we're going to create employment for our youth, and we are going to feed the world and tap into the world food market.
Let me hold you there, Prof. Paul, close for us. A minute, please.
I think our addition to that would just be like, with the simple realities we look at with the outlook on 2030 and the climate change, net zero moves, it's Africa can actually be the biggest exporter of credits. Yeah. So the truth is, how are we looking at the optimum way to generate those credits so we can unlock the value and revenue that should flow from there? As we look at our growing youth population, how are we steering them into industries that are actually very pro kind of low emissions because of our huge renewable energy capacity? How are we really understanding or building up opportunities to effectively channel renewable energy where it's needed? You don't need to live next to a geothermal plant to access that power. You could pipe it to where it needs to go. So what steps are we taking to make that a reality? And how are we really empowering people to really understand the value proposition that if I plant trees here as a community, can I actually see any revenue return on that? And we're working very actively to make sure that there's true equitable allocation in carbon revenue allocation, and with transparency you get from M-Pesa and the like, you can actually trace that money. It goes from him and goes all the way to X number. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. My director here is on my case. Thank you so much for being part of this conversation by sharing your questions online. Thank you for that. Thank you to my panelists for being on this conversation. I wish we had more time for this, but we'll have to leave it at that. News is up next, so stay tuned.